Hello everyone, my name is Alex, and if I'm wearing a Ukraine t-shirt, that means I'm Alex from Ukraine. And today we have an incredible guest in our program, a military analyst, a true sensation of analytical YouTube, and content creator Anders Nielsen. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
The so-called energy ceasefire is over. Last night, Russia shelled Kyiv again and completely destroyed several thermal power plants that cannot be restored. In your opinion, what kind of move was this, especially in light of the previous agreements?
I don't know, it was a weird ceasefire anyways from the beginning, right? The idea of having a ceasefire for 1 week, the Russia's pace of attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been maybe once every 10 days or something like that. So taking a 1 week break was pretty much nothing. And unsurprisingly, now there was this new attack. So I don't know. It doesn't. It was just a weird kind of show ceasefire, and now they're back. I think to the schedule, and it really also shows. I mean, there are supposed to be peace talks these days as well, right? And it really shows also that this is not really something that we should put a lot of hopes into.
President Zelensky stated as a result of this, the negotiation team was changed, will be changed. Do you think this is a right decision, and will it have any real impact of the negotiations?
Um, Whether it was the right decision, I don't know. But I think, anyways, we should not expect these negotiations to be really going anywhere. I don't see, frankly, I don't really see that the two sides have moved a whole lot. I mean, it's been a year now of Trump's negotiations or attempts at getting peace, right? He promised it would do this in 24 hours. A year later, I would say it hasn't really moved a whole lot. Um, Both Russia and Ukraine will say things about the negotiations that there is positive movement in different ways, or there are good discussions, or it seems like we're coming somewhere. But if you look at what uh, Russia and Ukraine are saying, the kinds of conditions both sides see for ending the war, I think it's quite clear that they are. It's very, very far apart still, and yeah, nothing has really indicated that Russia is willing to compromise on anything. Yeah, so I and Ukraine is not in a position where you have to give up, right? Or you have to give in to their demands. So it's a weird process.
In one of your recent interviews, you mentioned that Putin successors might have more flexibility. What specific model of behavior could a new Russian leader adopt in order to exit the war without losing domestic legitimacy?
The problem Putin has is that this is his war, right? He started it. He could have chosen not to. He took his country into this, and he's kind of tied to it, to this decision. And it would be very difficult for him to get out of the war and then maintain that legitimacy as the dictator of Russia. People have this idea that that dictators can do whatever they want and there are no checks at all, but that's not true. I mean, there are many limitations to their political power, and the political power they have comes from the sort of perceived legitimacy that they can make the right decisions and things like that. So if Putin ends this war in the short term, I think it would be fine. I think the Russian society would, broadly speaking, welcome an end to the war. But in the medium term, sort of in a few years perspective, it will be dangerous for him to do so, because it will be clear that Russia is worse off, and they didn't really get any of the original goals. They might have stolen a bit of land, but they did not achieve any of the original goals with starting the war. And this is something that is really could be damaging for Putin. Plus, and this we should not. It's not all just political tactics here. There is actually also the fact that Putin genuinely believes that this is the right thing to do. Right? He has these ideas about how Ukraine and Russia should be one country, and the idea of Ukrainian nationhood. It's not. I mean, it's something that needs to be eradicated. Ukrainians need to give up on this idea of being something other than a type of Russians, right? So he genuinely believes in this project. So we should not forget that part about it. But if there is a successor, then that opens the door for people to blame Putin on everything on Putin, and to say, well, the reason why things are so bad is because my predecessor made all these mistakes, and now we need to have a reckoning with our Putin past. So I think it was sort of like when Khrushchev came into office, and there was this the reckoning with the Stalin era. We could see something similar. So there would be a moment of opportunity there for some progress with it. And it doesn't really matter who comes into office in Russia. I mean, it doesn't have to be someone who is a liberal Democrat or something like that, right? It could be someone who ideologically aligns quite well with Putin, but just has a more realistic approach to the situation, and I can see that they're not actually winning the war, and if they really want to achieve anything long term, then they have to end this nightmare that they are in.
You argue that creating a European machine for financing Ukraine is critically important. How would this bureaucratic structure help neutralize risks if political forces less inclined to support Kyiv come to power in some European countries?
Yeah, I think what has happened with the recent decision in the EU to create this loan package that Ukraine may or maybe doesn't have to pay back, or that the funding has been moved from individual governments and into the European Union. And some of it will still be coming from individual governments. I think countries such as Denmark, for example, or Germany will probably pay more because they feel that more is needed. But a very large portion of this is now in the EU budget, and that does make it more resilient to those kinds of interruptions. So, for example, if there is a far-right president in France who doesn't really want to support Ukraine, then they cannot unilaterally remove all the French contribution, because a lot of it goes through the EU system. So, and also I think it's good because it means that many of these contributions are kind of a little bit hidden, or it becomes a kind of routine thing. Like in the big scheme of things, like this sum of money in the EU budget is not that ridiculous. So, you can get into some kind of planning rhythm.
If Russia begins officially registering Shadow Fleet vessels as Russian, would Europe be ready for direct maritime confrontation, given the legal loopholes related to stateless vessels would no longer apply?
I think what's interesting so far is that the Russians have used these stateless ships, and there actually are provisions that you can do something about stateless ships in international law. And the European countries have been very reluctant to do so, but it now looks that maybe there is a bit of appetite on doing it. We saw the French doing it. We saw the statement about the Baltic states now willing to do something about it. But as you say, I think what's going to happen is the Russians are going to just register all these ships as actually Russian. And that will complicate things a lot more, because you can't actually, within the sort of confines of international law, stop all Russian ships and say, well, this area is closed to Russian shipping. That would not be legal. And I think European countries will be very careful not to challenge international law and principles such as freedom of navigation a lot, because we depend on that as well in the world, right? And if we start going down this path, then that opens sort of opportunities for other countries such as China or Iran, or like what would then prevent them from doing the same to our ships? Because if we set the precedent there, so I think that would be a challenge for the Europeans to figure out what to do about it. And actually, I've been a little surprised that the Russians haven't just done it before. They haven't done that. They've seen it as, I think it's also related to the hybrid war kind of thing, that as long as these were stateless ships that were not officially Russian, then when we had these incidents where they would destroy the cables in the Baltic Sea or something, then officially it had nothing to do with Russia. But if it's a Russian ship, then it's maybe not so easy for them to do things like that.
Ukraine has already extended its attacks into the Mediterranean. How likely and how effective, in your view, would the opening of a Baltic front of Ukrainian sabotage operations against Russia exports be?
It might be effective against Russian exports. I think the problem is that Ukraine's partner countries in the Baltic area would be quite frustrated. I don't think it's something that we would like to see. So I think that's what's holding Ukraine back. Of course, there are also things like access to the shore, but you could have aerial drones attacking ships in the Baltic Sea. But frankly, I think the Ukrainian government would be concerned about jeopardizing popular support in the countries that support Ukraine the most, because we really don't want the publics in Denmark or Germany or Sweden to start talking about how Ukraine is jeopardizing the maritime environment or something like that on our shores.
As the United States has lost a significant part of its influence due to reduced support, can Ukraine now effort to ignore peace plans that you described as written in Moscow and continue the war until Russia is fully exhausted?
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, the you might have a better feeling for this than I do from the distance about how strong is the resolve in Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine is also exhausted. At least that's what I get from talking with Ukrainians. That I don't think the determination to keep on fighting is influenced like that. But I mean, after all, life is hard under the current conditions. But from a military point of view, I mean, with the current level of support, Ukraine can continue longer than I expect the Russian economy to be able to support this. Right? Essentially, it's a war about economies. This war of attrition will be won by the side that has the most sustainable war economy, and that, to me, the way I see it is still Ukraine. I think we can have discussions about, well, should we support Ukraine more? And I think the answer to that is yes. That would speed up the process of ending the war. Right? The war would end sooner if Ukraine received more help. But I think the current levels are also at a point now where this is unsustainable for Russia. But they might be able to do it another year, maybe another 2 years, right? And it's not going to be a sudden thing. It's going to be a gradual decline in their capability. And unfortunately, I think the kinds of attacks that we see on Kyiv, for example, and Russia's attempts at going after the civilian population is probably going to be what they can sustain the longest, and they might actually also be able to increase that even more, even as it becomes more and more difficult for them to make progress on the front line.
You predict that Europe may abandon American technologies, cloud solutions, software within the next 5 years out of fear of political blackmail. How would such a technological split affect NATO's military interoperability in the future?
I I don't know that I'd say that Europe will abandon American technology altogether, but there will be a diversification. We will see more and more non-American solutions being used. The French just made a very interesting decision about banning the use of Teams and Zoom and those kinds of conference call things, and I think we will see that European governments, European companies beginning to move away from Windows, for example, and more will start experimenting with using Linux computers because it just seems more safe in this environment. But I don't think the goal, and it's the same with weapons technology really, is not necessarily the goal not to use American equipment at all. The goal is to have a suite of different weapon systems that you can use. So if 100% of your air defense comes from the United States, then you're very vulnerable to blackmail from the White House, right? If it's only like maybe 25%, but if they start blackmailing you, you still have 75% left. Then you're not that exposed to that kind of pressure. So I think it's more those kinds of things we will see diversification, and hopefully the production lines in European defense, the defense sector will grow. So we will be able to produce enough air defense systems or missiles and things like that, right? Europe has some very good systems, but if we can't produce enough missiles, then it's not really that useful, and it will take some time, but hopefully we're seeing that coming.
You have described Russia's offensives as waves that are becoming smaller and smaller. Is this a tipping point after which Russia will completely lose the ability to conduct offensive operations, even on a local level?
I think we are approaching that point. Yeah, I mean, it is clearly becoming harder and harder. I think we're still seeing I think the waves you're referring to is that we're kind of seeing. Then there are periods where the Russians make progress, they push hard, and then there are periods where they kind of rebuild strength for the next push. Yeah, so they did push quite hard in the fall, and then right now, they're not taking so much territory. I think we should probably expect them to push hard again, and maybe into March or so. But I think we are approaching the point where it will be harder and harder and harder for Russia to make those advances. I think that it will become harder and harder for them to recruit the kinds of numbers that they need to just sustain the force, and that means that we might actually within 2026 come to the point where the Russian army is going to sort of decrease in size, right? That Ukraine is able to eliminate more Russian soldiers than they can recruit. So this could freeze the front line entirely, but I actually would not rule out the possibility that it could actually reverse the trend. So I don't think we're suddenly going to see the Ukrainians sort of throw the Russians all the way out. I mean, that would be really hard. That would require a total collapse. But what could perhaps actually do something for Putin's willingness to take the negotiations seriously is if he starts looking at sort of negative numbers when he looks at the gains for each month, right? As long as Putin can see that in this month we took 200 square kilometers or something like that. I think it was like 250 for January, a very, very small number, right? But it's still a number. It's still a positive, right? They took more than they lost. I think if Ukraine can bring it to the point where Putin will look at they actually lost every month something, then that will really challenge Putin's ability to explain the war in Russia, and that in itself would make the war legitimacy problem for him, and that might suddenly create this interest in serious negotiations.
If Russia no longer able to protect its allies, such as Assad, and can only offer something like a house outside Moscow, how will this affect its nuclear deterrence, and could other countries begin to view it as just another bluff?
I don't think so. I mean, in general, I would say this is maybe a bit counterproductive, but the weaker Russia is, the more they will depend on the nuclear aspect. So if you are strong, you have a lot of power, you have a system of allies, you have political influence, and you have a strong conventional military. You don't really need the nuclear weapons, right? But if you are weak, then you will have to rely more on that. Yeah, so I think we will actually see Russia sort of doing more and more nuclear posturing, and I think it's also important that we don't start falling into the trap of thinking that it won't work. Russia has the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. And even if some of it doesn't work, then they still have a lot, right? And we can talk about things like the Oreshnik missile, and well, it's not very precise. It doesn't hit what it's supposed to hit, or what have you, when they use it on Ukraine. But Russia is able to build these kinds of missiles that are designed for nuclear weapons, if the Oreshnik had a nuclear warhead, then obviously it would be plenty precise for the purpose, right? So I think we should expect Russia's nuclear weapons to work, and we should also expect them to become more and more dependent on them. It's actually one of the things that 20 years ago inspired the Russian military to begin the reform process that they embarked on there, because up through the 1990s, they were super frustrated that they did not have the conventional force and they had to rely on nuclear weapons, and they could see the weaknesses of that and how that did not really, they needed more conventional strength, so that they didn't have to just rattle the nuclear saber and things.
From your perspective, what do you think? What was the worst Putin's nightmare right now?
Yeah, I mean, Putin. The thing that Putin is always scared of is a revolution, right? That's a public uprising. That is so Putin is super scared of the population, and or the elites. It can also be a revolution from the elites, right? But we would call that a coup, I guess. But that is really what so much of his decision making is centered around regime security and how can I prevent a revolution tomorrow, right? That's so that is the big fear. I don't think that Putin takes really the prospect of losing the war in Ukraine. I think that to him is really hard to grasp, that idea that might happen. And I think that's one of the problems in this, that Putin doesn't really have a realistic understanding of where the war is going, because he lives in a kind of world where it's just sort of a basic assumption that Russia is a great power, so of course they're not going to lose a war, right? Russia never loses wars, right? He lives in that kind of bubble where it's not true, because just look at history, right? Russia loses wars all the time, right? That's another myth that is often mentioned is this thing about how Russians are willing to endure everything. Right? You can just throw everything at the Russians. They're just going to do whatever the emperor says, right? But Russia had 3 revolutions in the 20th century, right? In Denmark, we had 0. Right? It's just not true that the Russians will accept everything, and Putin knows that, so that's why he's so afraid of the population. And I think that's also why questions about regime security are going to be instrumental for ending the war in Ukraine. As long as he sees it as a bigger risk to himself to end the war than to continue the war, then he's going to continue it. He really has no desire to bring all those soldiers back home, for example. Right? That would be regime security risk. So he would much prefer some kind of solution where the war can keep going in one way or another.
But if we imagine that a revolution is brewing in Moscow, what do you think Putin would do?
Um, I mean, I think the general process that's going on in Russia right now is that it's one about more and more totalitarianism, right? More and more repression to keep these things under control. So, and I don't think this is really a reversible thing. So the idea that Russia could end the war and then go back to how things were in 2021, where Russians still had a lot of personal freedom. They didn't have political freedom, but they had a lot of personal freedom. I don't think that's possible, really. So I think the overall trend is toward more and more repression, and obviously that's also what he would try to do there. But another thing I also think we should be aware of is that Putin will probably see it as some kind of hybrid attack on Russia. He would probably interpret turmoil on the streets of Moscow as something that is orchestrated by the British or the Europeans or the CIA or what have you. So I think he's quite likely also to respond outwards. And it is really the big, sort of, for me, the big scary scenario in this, that Putin suddenly experiences this kind of pressure, and then he starts maybe a direct war against a NATO country or something like that, because he sees it as us attacking him, because of course the Russians would not do this without being somehow paid by the CIA or what have you, right? So he will feel justified in responding directly militarily against NATO, and also just to divert attention, right? Let's create an even bigger war, so we can, instead of having all these people on the streets protesting against me, let's draft them into the army, right?
Would it be possible for Putin
Would it be possible for Putin to do what? To start a war
to,
with?
yeah, start a war with NATO if he understand and realize that he definitely collapsed in Ukraine?
In Ukraine? I think there are two scenarios where Putin would start a war against another European country. One is this thing about where he's kind of like facing a revolution inside of Russia. He's just willing to do anything, right? To just throwing all the balls up in the air to see if something works, right? So he would do that out of a kind of desperation there. Another reason why Putin might want to start a war against another European country would be if he's facing the prospect of gradually losing the war in Ukraine. And that is actually the trajectory I think we're on. I mean, like that he is actually gradually losing the war in Ukraine. He just hasn't realized it yet. But what is keeping Ukraine in the fight is the funding from other European countries. And if Western Europe stops supporting Ukraine, he would be able to win. Right? So that. I mean, I would be. I'm quite concerned about this prospect that he would see an attack on a European country as a way out of this, a way to make us stop supporting Ukraine because we need to spend those resources on ourselves, or we will understand that we don't want to go down this path because we don't want war with Russia or something like that. So we will give him what he wants. I mean, that's the other prospect there. And both of these scenarios are scary in the sense that they can happen very soon. In many European countries, you have intelligence agencies making assessments about how long will it take for Russia to rebuild before they could start a new war against another European country. those estimates vary, right? I think the Germans say 5 years. In Denmark, they say 2 years. But there are different estimates of that. But the two scenarios I describe here, they don't require any period of rebuilding. That would be the Russian army beginning to fight with whatever they have now, and in an anticipation that this is necessary because there is a desperate situation and we need to turn things around. We just need to do something dramatic, and then let's see if it works, right? But the alternative to not doing it is even worse.
You argue that forced mobilization will destroy the implied deal between the Kremlin and society. Stay out of politics and we'll leave you alone. What forms of protest might we see in Russia if they are not peace rallies, but protests over everyday living conditions?
That would be protests such. I mean, we see protests regularly in Russia. We have seen it also in the past, but we still. It was more in the past very often about environmental things, for example, right? That even though you didn't have really political freedom in the traditional sense, within certain kinds of topics, you could still go on the streets and protest about something, the environment not being taken care of in a certain area, or cultural things like somebody wants to tear down a church or something like that, right? So you could see protests like that, and I think basically that's how it would start. Different kinds of small protests about inflation or something like that. But I think the key thing to understand about this is that we very often talk about the Russians as being depoliticized. So we say that the Russians are not really, they are not really interested in politics, so they are not using the agency they have. I think that's getting it kind of upside down, right? I think what Putin is afraid of is that people suddenly start understanding that they have agency. They go on the streets and they see that they are not alone, and suddenly, because they understand that I actually do have agency, I can protest about things, I can do something about living conditions, I can try to influence politics in one way or another, then suddenly they will begin to have political opinions, right? And so I think it would start as something entirely different, absolutely not at all related to the war in Ukraine. It will not be protests about how let's stop killing Ukrainians. I'm sorry, but that's just not where they are. But that's where it might go, right? And you would see on the streets of Russian cities people with totally different agendas. Some will be complaining about the economy. Some would be complaining about the wages, or not. Some would be complaining about the utilities not working, or the trains don't run, or some will be complaining about the mobilization, or that they want their husband back, or what have you. But all these different people with different agendas could join together and suddenly, figure out we have something in common here, right? So I think that's the kind of scenario that he's afraid of. And these things can come quickly and unexpectedly, and that's also what he understands, that and that's why he has been so reluctant to make those hard choices and force Russians into the war. And he really, the way the Russians are manning the army is absolutely ridiculous from a financial point of view, right? You spend a lot of money, give people high bonuses, to draft them into the army, and then they are dead within a couple of weeks, right? That's absolutely stupid use of money, because you could just say that people have to, right? You could just make forced mobilization and then it's free, and you could spend all that money on something else, right? But he's not doing that because he is afraid of the Russian population.
Is it technically possible to freeze a war in the era of mass use of long-range drones if economic warfare and strikes on infrastructure continue regardless on the front line?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I have the answer, but I many people make the comparison to the Korean War and say, well, we might end up in some kind of Korean solution, right, between Russia and Ukraine, where you have some kind of demilitarized zone, 15 kilometers or something, and then no, it's just no man's land, and then I don't think that would work. I mean, we have to be aware at least that this was a very unique sort of solution to a problem in Korea in the 1950s, where first Korea is a peninsula and it's not that wide, and you can just sort of split it in the middle, right? The border between Russia and Ukraine, it's long. It's like incredibly long. And the other thing is the weapons technology, right? They're just saying something like 15 kilometers today. That's not going to cut it. Like an FPV drone today will fly further than that. So, and with the kinds of weapons that both Ukraine and Russia have now, the long-range strike drones, and you can hit thousands of kilometers, and like, is it even meaningful to talk about a frozen conflict, or like I doubt it. So I don't know. It's possible, and I think for Putin that is maybe the kind of solution that he would be looking for. Actually, at this point, if he starts realizing that he's not going to achieve the goals he has of gaining political control of all of Ukraine and sort of reuniting the Russians and the Ukrainians in a kind of Russian empire, like if he understands that that's not going to work, but he still has the regime security risks, then he might try to aim for that kind of frozen conflict kind of thing, because that will allow him to keep the war going and keep the repression in Russia and not bring the army home. But it's going to be difficult in a time when you can't really isolate the war to a frontline area.
Anders, I want to say thank you for your great analysis, for your brilliant thoughts, for your work, what do you do on your channel. Thank you so much. I'm really appreciate that conversation with you, and I want to say all my viewers, our viewers, we have today an incredible guest on our program, a military analyst and true sensation of analytical YouTube, and a content creator, Anders Pak Nielsen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.